The rancher gave shelter to his Apache neighbor. At dawn she returned. "Does your promise still stand?" John Harris had always been a man of routine. Every morning he woke up before the sun peeked over the desert horizon. His ranch was vast, stretching for miles of dry, dusty land dotted with hardy cacti and rugged shrubs. Raising cattle was not an easy life, but it was the only life he knew. His father had handed the land to him, and his father's father before that. The Harris family name had been tied to this land for generations. John knew every ridge, every hollow, and every spring that hid quietly among the rocks. He respected the land. It gave him life, and in return he worked tirelessly to care for it. On one such morning, the sky seemed different. A subtle gray hung low over the desert, unusual for that time of year. John had learned to read the skies like he read a book. He could tell when rain was coming long before the first drop fell. As he moved among his cattle, checking their health and feeding the weaker ones, he noticed the wind pick up. Dust began to swirl across the dry earth. At first, it was gentle, but soon it grew into a harsh gust that tugged at his clothes and whipped across his face. John frowned. Storms in this part of Arizona were rare in early spring, and sudden ones could be dangerous, especially in the open desert. By mid-morning, the wind had become a raging force. The sky darkened, clouds rolling in faster than John had ever seen. The cattle began to grow restless, huddling together for safety. He whistled sharply, calling them, guiding them to the safety of the small corral near his cabin. His experience told him the storm would not just be heavy rain. It could bring lightning, flooding in the dry washes, and even destroy parts of the land if he wasn't careful. He worked quickly, moving from one animal to the next, checking fences, securing gates, and making sure nothing was left exposed to the elements. It was then that he heard the faint sound of footsteps approaching his cabin. In the middle of a desert storm, this was unusual. Normally, people stayed safely in their homes during such weather. He squinted through the whipping rain and saw a figure struggling across the uneven ground. It was a woman, barely more than a young girl by appearance, her clothes soaked, her dark hair plastered to her face. She stumbled forward, clutching something to her chest. John immediately grabbed his coat and stepped outside. The wind hit him like a wall, but he forced his way through the dust and rain. "Hey!" he shouted, though he wasn't sure if she could hear him over the roar of the storm. "You need to get inside." The figure looked up, her eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. John noticed she was Native American, her features delicate yet strong, and her clothes suggested she was from one of the Apache families living nearby. He could see the mud caking her boots and the streaks of rain on her face. She was shaking, and not from the cold alone. I need shelter," she shouted, barely audible. "My home, it's gone." John didn't hesitate. He motioned her toward his cabin, raising his voice over the storm. "Come on, hurry." She stumbled into the open doorway, dripping water all over the wooden floor. John quickly closed the door behind her and set about trying to dry her off. He handed her a thick blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders. She shivered violently, and he could see the relief in her eyes that she was finally out of the storm. "What happened?" he asked gently, trying to keep his voice calm despite the adrenaline still pumping from running through the storm. "My house, it collapsed," she said, her voice shaking. "The wind, it was too strong. We had to leave, or we would have." She trailed off, glancing at the cabin walls as if to see if she would be judged for asking for help. John nodded. He didn't need to ask who she was or where she came from. In this area, news of families and homes at risk traveled fast. Despite the long history of tension between settlers like him and the Apache families nearby, he knew that in moments like this, such divisions didn't matter. A life in danger demanded immediate action. "You're safe now," he said firmly. "You can stay here tonight. I promise no one will harm you." The girl's eyes widened. She looked at him cautiously, as though testing the truth of his words. Trust wasn't given easily in this land. Too many people had learned the hard way that promises could be broken. Yet something in John's tone, steady and unwavering, seemed to reach her. She nodded slowly, grateful but still unsure. Inside, the cabin was warm, the fire crackling in the stone fireplace. John moved quickly, getting a dry set of clothes for her. She changed quietly in the small bedroom while he went to fetch some food and water. The wind howled outside, but inside the cabin there was a sense of calm. John could feel the tension in the room. She wasn't used to receiving kindness from someone outside her community, and he wasn't used to having a stranger depend entirely on him. "Here," he said, setting a plate of food in front of her. "Eat something. You've had a rough morning." She hesitated, then took the food, eating slowly, her eyes never leaving him. There was a silent conversation happening in that space, filled with questions neither of them could yet speak aloud. Questions about trust, about safety, about what it meant to extend kindness to someone you barely knew. "Thank you," she finally said. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried sincerity. "You don't have to thank me," John replied. "Anyone would do the same if they could." He forced a small smile. "Storms like this, they don't care who you are." For a while they sat in silence, listening to the wind battering the cabin walls. John glanced at her, noticing the exhaustion etched in her features. She had clearly been through a long, terrifying journey to reach here. He remembered the nights he had spent alone in the desert during storms, feeling the power of nature pressing down on him. He knew she had felt that same fear. Eventually, she spoke again. "I didn't know anyone would help me," she said, her voice tentative. "People, they don't usually," John shook his head. "That's not true. There's more good than you think. Sometimes it just takes one person to make the difference. You made it here. That shows courage." The girl nodded, a small spark of hope flickering in her eyes. She was still wary, but the storm outside had given her a temporary refuge, and John's actions were the beginning of something she hadn't expected: safety and perhaps even trust. As the evening wore on, the storm began to ease. The wind's roar softened, replaced by a gentle patter of rain against the cabin roof. John checked the cattle once more, ensuring they were secure, and returned inside to find her dozing lightly in the blanket he had given her. He watched her for a moment, realizing how fragile life could be in the desert. One wrong step, one bad storm, and everything could be lost. Yet there was resilience in her, a quiet determination that reminded him of himself. He moved to the window, looking out at the darkened landscape. The storm had transformed the desert into a wild, almost otherworldly place. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the twisted shapes of trees and rocks. For a moment he felt a deep respect for the power of nature and for the courage it takes to survive in it. Turning back to the girl, he made a silent vow. "No matter what happens, I'll keep my promise," he whispered. "Tonight, you are safe here." And in that small cabin, against the backdrop of a desert storm, a fragile trust began to form between two people from very different worlds. It was a beginning, a small moment of humanity, in a land where survival often demanded suspicion and self-reliance. Little did they know, this night would mark the start of a bond that neither the desert nor the storms could easily break. A bond born from kindness, courage, and the simple act of keeping a promise when it mattered most. The night passed slowly but safely. Outside, the storm had left the desert wet and glistening under the soft light of a crescent moon. Inside the cabin, a quiet calm had settled. John Harris had stayed awake longer than usual, listening to the fading sound of rain dripping from the eaves. The warmth of the fire filled the room, and the smell of wet earth mixed with smoke made the cabin feel safe, almost like a small fortress against the wild desert outside. Lita, the young Apache woman who had sought shelter the night before, slept fitfully under the thick blanket John had given her. The fear and exhaustion from her long journey were still visible in her tense posture and the occasional twitch of her hands. John watched her for a few minutes, quietly admiring her resilience. Even in her most vulnerable moments, there was something strong about her. He could see it in the way she held herself, even while asleep, and he knew she had survived far more than most people could imagine. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the cabin walls, Lita had already awoken. She stretched slowly, rubbing her arms where the blanket had covered them, and looked around the cabin. The fire was dying down, leaving a warm glow rather than a bright heat. She noticed John standing by the window, staring out at the desert. He seemed deep in thought, but as she moved closer, he turned and smiled. "Morning," he said softly. "Sleep well." She nodded, though her eyes were still cautious. Yes, thank you. You don't have to thank me," John replied. "You were in trouble. Anyone would have done the same." Lita hesitated for a moment, then sat down on the edge of the bed. She seemed unsure how to continue the conversation. There was a history between their peoples that made trust difficult. Apache families and settlers had long lived side by side, but often with suspicion or fear. Lita had grown up hearing stories of people who could not be trusted, and now she was face to face with someone who had offered her shelter without question. She didn't know what to think. I've never been treated like this," she admitted quietly. "People usually, they don't help us, they stay away." John nodded, understanding more than she realized. "I know, and I know it's hard to believe, but not everyone thinks that way. Sometimes it just takes one person to do what is right. Tonight, you were in danger. I did what I could to keep you safe, that's all." Her eyes softened a little. She seemed to relax, even if only slightly. I think I understand, but why help me?" John shrugged. "Because it's the right thing to do. It doesn't matter where you come from or who your people are. Life in the desert is hard enough without fear. Everyone deserves safety, at least for a night." The words seemed to surprise her. She had not expected honesty or kindness to be so simple. Most of her life had taught her that help came with conditions, that favors were given only when something was expected in return. But here was a man who gave her safety without asking for anything. She looked at him, studying his face, trying to find a hint of hidden motive. There was none, only sincerity. They spent the morning slowly, talking in small, cautious steps. Lita told John about her family, how they had been forced to leave their home after a flash flood had destroyed it. She spoke of her father, who had always taught her to respect the land and survive with dignity, and her mother, who had been kind but worried constantly about the dangers around them. She spoke softly, almost as if her words might vanish in the air if spoken too loudly. John listened carefully, realizing that every word was important. He shared some of his own story, though more carefully. He spoke of his ranch, of the long hours and the hard work required to keep it running, and of his family's history on this land. He didn't speak of battles or disputes. Instead, he focused on the connection he had with the land itself, the cattle, and the rhythm of life in the desert. As the hours passed, a quiet understanding began to form between them. It was not yet friendship, not yet trust in its fullest form, but it was a start. They had shared shelter, warmth, and conversation, small but meaningful steps toward bridging the distance between their worlds. Outside, the storm had left a different desert than the one they had seen the night before. The dust had settled, leaving a clean, fresh scent. Small puddles reflected the rising sun, and the desert plants glistened with raindrops. Birds began to stir, their calls echoing faintly across the empty land. The change was sudden but beautiful, reminding them both that even the harshest storms eventually give way to calm. John decided to take Lita outside for a moment. She hesitated, unsure if she was ready to face the open desert after the night she had endured, but his tone was gentle. "You need to see that it's okay now," he said. "The storm has passed. The land is safe again. Come on." As she stepped outside, the sunlight hit her face and she blinked against the brightness. The wind had calmed, leaving only a soft breeze. John showed her the cattle, explaining which ones were older, which were sick, and which calves were new. He spoke patiently, answering her questions and sharing little details about ranch life. Lita listened carefully, absorbing each word, and occasionally smiling at small moments of humor or unexpected beauty. After a while, they returned to the cabin. Lita helped John with small tasks, such as preparing breakfast and organizing supplies. The work was simple, but it allowed them to continue talking and understanding each other. Lita began to feel more comfortable in John's presence. She noticed that he didn't treat her differently because of who she was. He treated her as a person first, and that simple fact was both surprising and comforting. As the morning turned to afternoon, a moment of silence fell between them. Lita looked out the window, watching the desert stretch endlessly into the distance. She thought of her home, now damaged and uncertain, and wondered what the future might hold. John noticed her gaze and said quietly, "You'll be okay. Tonight you were safe, and tomorrow, well, we'll figure that out together, one step at a time." She turned to him, surprised by the reassurance in his voice. "One step at a time," she repeated softly, as if testing the words. They felt right, grounding her in the present instead of the fear of what might come next. John nodded. "Exactly. You survived a storm last night. You're stronger than you think. And I'll keep my promise, you're safe while you're here." Lita's eyes met his, and for the first time that day, she smiled fully. It was small but genuine, a spark of trust forming where only fear had existed before. The cabin no longer felt like a temporary refuge. It began to feel like a safe space, a place where she could breathe without worrying about what would happen next. As the day wore on, John and Lita continued to share stories and small tasks. She told him about her people's traditions, how they respected the land and animals, and the lessons passed down from elders about survival and community. John listened intently, fascinated by her knowledge and the wisdom she carried. He realized that this was more than just a chance encounter. It was a meeting of two worlds, each with lessons to share. By late afternoon, the sun had risen high, casting golden light across the desert. The storm had long since passed, but its effects were visible: washed-out tracks in the sand, small streams formed in the hollows, and the earthy smell of fresh rain lingering everywhere. Lita stood by the cabin door, looking out at the landscape. She felt a mixture of relief, hope, and uncertainty. She was safe, yes, but the journey ahead would still be challenging. John noticed her expression. "I know this isn't easy," he said gently, "but you made it through the worst part. The storm is over. Now it's just about moving forward one step at a time." Lita nodded, feeling the truth of his words. "Yes, one step at a time," she said again, almost like a promise to herself. As the evening approached, John prepared a simple meal, and they sat together quietly, the comfort of companionship filling the room. The tension from the storm was gone, replaced by a sense of cautious optimism. Both of them knew that challenges were still ahead, but for now there was safety, warmth, and the beginning of trust. In that small cabin, two people from different worlds began to understand each other. The storm had brought them together, but it was their actions, kindness, patience, and honesty that would define the rest of their time together. The day ended with the promise of tomorrow, a quiet acknowledgement that even in a harsh and unforgiving land, trust could grow, and bonds could form where none were expected. Morning came quietly to the desert, with soft light filtering over the horizon and painting the rugged landscape in shades of gold and orange. The air was cool but fresh, carrying the faint scent of rain that had washed the earth the day before. Birds began to stir, their songs echoing across the empty plains. Inside the cabin, John Harris stirred awake before the sun had fully risen, as he always did. His routine had not changed, but the presence of Lita, the young Apache woman he had sheltered, made this morning feel different. He quietly moved around the cabin, tending to the fire and preparing a simple breakfast. The storm had passed, but the memory of the raging wind and pounding rain still lingered in his mind. He thought about Lita, about the courage it had taken her to reach his cabin the night before. She had faced the storm alone and had trusted a stranger for her safety. That trust weighed on him like a responsibility he could not ignore. He had promised her safety, and he intended to keep that promise. Lita awoke to the soft light streaming through the window. She rubbed her eyes and sat up slowly, stretching her arms. The blanket around her shoulders had kept her warm, but she still felt the lingering chill from the storm. As she looked around the cabin, she saw John moving quietly, preparing food. For a moment she just watched him, noticing the care with which he handled even the simplest tasks. It was clear that he treated everything and everyone with attention and respect. "Good morning," John said, noticing her awake. His voice was calm and steady, carrying a sense of reassurance. "Morning," Lita replied softly, her voice still quiet with the remnants of sleep. She hesitated for a moment, then asked, Are you sure it's safe now?" John smiled slightly. "The storm is over. The desert is calm again. You're safe here. I'll make sure of it." She nodded, unsure if she should trust the words fully, but the warmth of the cabin and the calmness in John's tone eased her fears slightly. She stepped outside for a moment, letting the cool morning air touch her face. The desert looked completely transformed from the night before. Puddles reflected the rising sun, and the plants glistened with tiny droplets of water. The beauty of it was almost magical, and for a moment she forgot the fear and exhaustion that had plagued her for days. John followed her outside, giving her a respectful distance but remaining close enough to offer protection if needed. "Look at this," he said softly, gesturing to the desert. "The storm passed and now the land looks alive again. You can see how strong it is. You survived it. You've got that same strength inside you." Lita's eyes met his, and she felt something shift inside her. His words were simple, but they carried weight. They acknowledged her courage without minimizing it, and they offered reassurance without demanding anything in return. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of belonging, even if only temporary. They spent the morning together in quiet tasks. John showed her around the cabin, explaining the routine of the ranch and how he cared for the land and the animals. He taught her how to check on the cattle, how to recognize signs of illness, and how to secure the gates against sudden weather changes. Lita listened attentively, absorbing every detail. She had grown up in the desert too, but the life of a rancher was different from the life she had known. She admired John's knowledge and dedication, and she could see the care he put into every action. As they worked, they began to talk more freely. Lita shared stories about her family and community, about the traditions her people had followed for generations. She spoke of respect for the land, for the animals, and for each other. She described how her elders had taught her to survive, to be brave, and to trust wisely. John listened, fascinated by the wisdom in her words. He realized that there was much he could learn from her, just as there was much she could learn from him. At one point, they paused to rest under the shade of a large mesquite tree near the cabin. The morning sun had risen higher, and its warmth was gentle but comforting. Lita looked out at the vast desert stretching beyond the ranch, her thoughts drifting to her home, now damaged by the storm. She felt a pang of sadness, thinking of her family and the challenges they would face in rebuilding. John noticed the shadow cross her face. "I know it's hard," he said quietly. "Your home was damaged and you've been through a lot. But you're safe for now and we'll figure out the next steps together, one thing at a time." Lita's eyes softened. She had repeated that phrase herself yesterday, almost like a mantra. Hearing it from John, spoken with genuine care, made it feel real. "Yes, one thing at a time," she said softly, almost to herself. The day continued with small tasks and quiet conversation. They repaired minor damage to the cabin from the storm, fixed a few fences, and checked the water supply. Each action brought them closer together, building trust through shared work and mutual respect. Lita began to see John not just as a stranger who had offered shelter, but as someone dependable, someone who could be trusted in a world that often felt harsh and unforgiving. As afternoon turned to evening, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the desert. The warmth of the day lingered, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the mesquite trees. Lita and John sat outside, watching the cattle graze quietly in the fading light. It was a peaceful moment, a rare pause in lives that were usually filled with struggle and vigilance. "You've helped me more than you know," Lita said finally, breaking the silence. Her voice was steady now, carrying gratitude without hesitation. John shook his head. "I didn't do it for thanks. I did it because it was the right thing, but I'm glad you're here safe." Lita looked at him, noticing the sincerity in his eyes. She felt a connection forming, one built on actions rather than words, on trust rather than history. The barriers between them, shaped by years of division and suspicion, were slowly starting to crumble. As night approached, they returned to the cabin. John prepared a simple meal and they ate together quietly, sharing stories and laughter. The storm that had brought them together now seemed like a distant memory, replaced by the comfort of companionship and understanding. Lita felt a sense of relief she had not felt in a long time. She was safe, fed, and beginning to trust someone outside her community. Before going to sleep, Lita looked out the cabin window at the desert bathed in moonlight. The land looked peaceful now, but she knew it could change in an instant. She thought about the promise John had made, and a small smile crossed her face. It was a promise that mattered more than anything else in that moment, a promise of safety, of respect, and of trust. John noticed her glance and nodded slightly. "Sleep well tonight," he said. "Tomorrow is a new day and we'll face it together." Lita nodded, feeling the truth in his words. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and lay down, closing her eyes. The fear of the storm was gone, replaced by a quiet hope. She didn't know what the future would bring, but for now, she had found safety and trust in an unexpected place. In that small cabin, two people from different worlds had learned something important. The storm had forced them together, but it was their choices, kindness, patience, and honesty, that created a bond neither of them could ignore. They were no longer just neighbors by circumstance. They were companions who had shared a night of fear and a day of understanding. As they drifted off to sleep, the desert outside was calm and quiet. The moon shone over the land, reflecting off the puddles left by the storm. For the first time in a long while, Lita felt a sense of peace. She knew the journey ahead would be difficult, but she also knew that she was not alone. John Harris had kept his promise, and that simple act of kindness had changed everything. And as the night deepened, a new day was waiting just beyond the horizon. A day that would test trust, courage, and the strength of a promise that had been made at the height of a desert storm. The days after the storm were calm, but life on the ranch never stayed quiet for long. John Harris had grown accustomed to the unpredictability of the desert, and he knew that challenges often came without warning. He rose early, as always, walking among his cattle and checking the fences, the water, and the small patches of grass that survived despite the harsh climate. The storm had left its mark. Some fences were damaged, a few patches of grazing land were washed out, and the tracks of the cattle were mudded and uneven. John worked steadily, repairing what he could and preparing for the next unpredictable change. Lita, meanwhile, had begun to settle into the rhythm of the ranch life. She had learned quickly how to handle small tasks, from feeding the cattle to repairing simple fences and helping with chores around the cabin. But while her hands were busy, her mind often wandered to her family and the home they had lost to the storm. She worried about how they were surviving, about what challenges the next week would bring, and whether she had truly made the right decision in trusting John Harris. Despite these worries, she also felt something she had not experienced for a long time: safety. The cabin and the ranch had become a place where she could breathe, think, and recover from the fear that had haunted her. One morning, as the sun rose and painted the desert in golden light, John noticed something unusual. The water supply in one of the small troughs for the cattle was running low. He frowned and went to inspect it. The pipes were clear and the troughs had not been damaged by the storm, yet the water was disappearing faster than it should have. John scratched his head. It was strange, and in the desert, any shortage of water could quickly become a serious problem. He needed to find a solution before it affected the cattle. Lita had been nearby, helping with the fences when she saw John inspecting the water. She approached quietly, offering her observations. "Sometimes there are hidden springs," she said softly. "I've seen them in the desert. Water flows underground and some springs appear after storms." John turned to her, surprised by her knowledge. "Hidden springs?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes, my people know where they are. We've used them for generations. If you want, I can show you some. It might solve your problem." John considered this for a moment. He knew that asking for help was not always easy for someone from a different community, but Lita seemed willing, and her knowledge of the land could be invaluable. "All right," he said finally, "show me." They set off together, walking through the desert. Lita led the way with quiet confidence, moving easily over the uneven ground, pointing out subtle signs of water underground, the way certain plants grew, the patterns in the sand, and the shape of the rocks. John followed closely, impressed by her skill and attention to detail. He realized that her knowledge was a gift, one that could save his cattle and possibly help many others in the area. After some time, they reached a small hollow where a tiny spring bubbled up from the ground. The water was clear and fresh, glistening in the sunlight. John knelt down and tested it, tasting the cool liquid. It was perfect enough to refill the troughs and provide for the cattle. He looked at Lita, amazed. "You were right," he said. "I never would have found this on my own. Thank you." Lita smiled faintly. "I'm glad I could help. It's good to see people and animals survive together. That's how we have always lived." The moment marked a turning point. Their trust had grown beyond the small cabin and the temporary safety it provided. They were now working together, combining their knowledge and skills to overcome real challenges. The bond that had started in fear and uncertainty was deepening into something stronger: mutual respect and reliance. But the desert, as always, had its tests. Later that week, news reached John that his ranch might face a shortage of supplies due to a delayed shipment from town. Feed for the cattle, tools for repairs, and even some basic necessities would not arrive on time. John felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Without these supplies, the ranch could suffer serious losses. The thought of failing to care for his animals and the land he loved weighed heavily on him. Lita noticed his concern and spoke gently. "I can help," she said. "There are plants in the desert that can be used for feed if necessary, and we can find ways to repair fences and tools with what we have. It won't be easy, but it's possible." John looked at her, impressed again by her practical thinking. "You really know a lot about surviving here," he said. "I didn't realize how much your people understand the land." Lita nodded. "We have to. The desert can be unforgiving. You learn quickly to work with what you have, to use the land wisely. And you learn to trust the people who help you." Together, they began to implement solutions. Lita showed John which plants could temporarily feed the cattle. They repaired broken fences using wood and stones from the nearby area. They created a plan to stretch the water supply until the shipment arrived. The work was exhausting, but it brought a sense of accomplishment and confidence. John realized that Lita was not just a survivor. She was a problem solver, a teacher, and now an ally. As the days passed, their bond strengthened further. They shared stories of their pasts, of hardships and lessons learned. John spoke of his family's history on the ranch, of storms and droughts, of the pride he felt in keeping the land alive. Lita shared more about her people, about traditions, survival skills, and the wisdom passed down from elders. Each story revealed more about the other, building a connection that went beyond words. Yet, even as trust grew, there was still an underlying tension. John knew that the desert could change quickly, that threats could appear without warning. He also understood that Lita's family might be concerned about her staying so close to settlers. There were unspoken rules and boundaries that they both had to respect. Their trust was strong, but it had to be handled carefully, with patience and understanding. One afternoon, while they were checking the fences, a sudden dust cloud appeared on the horizon. John immediately recognized it as a group of cattle straying from a neighboring ranch. If left unchecked, they could wander onto his property, causing damage and stress for his herd. He whistled sharply, calling the cattle back, and Lita ran alongside him, helping to guide the animals safely. Their teamwork was seamless, born from days of shared effort and trust. Afterward, they rested under the shade of a large tree. John handed Lita some water and they sat quietly, watching the desert stretch endlessly around them. "You've helped me more than I can say," John said finally, "not just with the ranch but with trust. You showed me that helping someone doesn't have to be complicated, it's just right." Lita smiled, a genuine warmth in her eyes. "And you've helped me too," she said softly. "You showed me that not everyone is against us, that kindness still exists. That sometimes promises really are kept." The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the desert and bathing the land in a warm, golden light. The day had been hard, filled with work, problem-solving, and unexpected challenges. But it had also been a day of growth, understanding, and deepening trust. Both John and Lita realized that their partnership was no longer temporary, it had become essential. They relied on each other, not just for survival but for guidance, companionship, and the reassurance that someone was there who truly cared. As night fell, the desert grew quiet, the stars shining brightly above. John and Lita returned to the cabin, exhausted but satisfied. The water supply was secure, the fences repaired, and the cattle safe. The immediate threats had been handled, but they both knew the desert would bring more challenges in the days ahead. Yet they also knew that together, they could face whatever came. Their bond had been tested, strengthened by necessity and choice, and it had proven resilient. Before going to sleep, Lita stepped outside one last time, gazing at the night sky. She thought about the storm, the challenges of the past days, and the promise John had made to keep her safe. She whispered to herself, "Yes, his promise still stands." And in that moment she knew that it was not just words, it was a commitment built on trust, action, and understanding. Inside the cabin, John watched her from the doorway, feeling a quiet pride. He had kept his promise, but more importantly, he had formed a bond that neither storms nor challenges could easily break. The trust between them had grown into something rare and meaningful, something that would shape the days ahead and test the limits of courage, kindness, and integrity. The desert night was calm, but the future was unknown. New challenges would come, and decisions would have to be made. Yet John and Lita now faced the future together, united by trust, respect, and the shared knowledge that promises made in the midst of storms were worth keeping. The days after the storm had turned into weeks, and the desert began to settle into a rhythm once again. The harsh winds and pounding rain had become memories, replaced by bright sunlight and calm nights. John Harris's ranch was running smoothly, the cattle grazing safely, the fences repaired, and the water supply secured thanks to Lita's knowledge of hidden springs. Life was far from easy in the desert, but for the first time in a long while, there was stability and a sense of quiet satisfaction. Lita had stayed longer than anyone had expected. What had started as a temporary shelter for a night had transformed into weeks of shared work, learning, and growing trust. She had become an essential part of the ranch's daily life. John had come to rely on her knowledge of the land, the desert plants, and the hidden sources of water. In return, Lita had learned much from John about cattle care, ranch maintenance, and the ways of life that had been foreign to her before. Together, they had formed a partnership built on respect, courage, and mutual support. Despite the progress, Lita could not help but think about her family and the home she had left behind. She worried about the hardships they might still face, about the challenges of rebuilding, and about whether her decision to stay with John's ranch, even temporarily, might be questioned by her elders. Yet the bond she had formed with John had given her a sense of confidence she had never felt before. She knew she had made the right choice, that she had found someone who truly kept his word. One morning, as the first light of dawn spread across the desert, Lita stepped outside the cabin. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of dry earth and grass. She looked at the horizon, where the sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows over the rolling hills and scattered trees. The beauty of the desert in the morning always struck her, but today it felt different. Today she felt a deep sense of gratitude and determination. She thought about the promise John had made to her that she would be safe, and realized how much it had meant, not just as words but as action. John joined her shortly after, carrying a bucket of water for the cattle. He greeted her with a warm smile, the kind that made her feel welcome and valued. "Morning," he said. "The cattle are ready for a drink. The day looks good." Calm skies, plenty of sunlight, and a strong wind from the west, perfect for checking the fences. Lita smiled back. "Morning. Yes, it's beautiful, and I think it's a good day to make sure everything is ready for the coming week. No surprises, hopefully." John laughed softly. "In the desert, you never know about surprises, but together, we can handle them." They walked to the troughs first, filling them with fresh water from the hidden spring that Lita had shown John weeks earlier. The cattle gathered around eagerly, their low moans and movement creating a comforting rhythm. John and Lita worked side by side, pouring water, checking the fences, and ensuring that everything was in order. Their movements were smooth and coordinated, the result of days of shared work and trust. After the cattle were taken care of, John suggested they take a walk across the property. He wanted to show Lita a section of the desert she had not yet seen, a place where the land sloped gently downward into a small valley dotted with wildflowers that bloomed in the spring. Lita agreed eagerly, curious to see the desert from another perspective. As they walked, John spoke of his family's history on the land, telling stories of his father and grandfather, of storms survived, cattle raised, and the challenges of life in the desert. Lita listened carefully, absorbing every detail. In turn, she shared more about her people, about traditions, lessons, and the ways her family had survived for generations in harsh conditions. Their conversation was quiet, respectful, and full of understanding. They no longer spoke cautiously. Their words carried warmth and a shared sense of purpose. When they reached the valley, the sight took Lita's breath away. The wildflowers were in full bloom, painting the landscape in colors she had never imagined could exist in such a harsh desert. She paused, taking it all in. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "I've never seen anything like this." John smiled. "The desert can be harsh, yes. But it has its own kind of beauty if you know where to look. You taught me that, you know. Sometimes it's the quiet, hidden things that matter most, like the spring that saved my cattle." Lita looked at him, surprised by the honesty and depth in his words. I just shared what I knew, but you used it to make a difference. You trusted me, and that made all the difference." They stood together in silence for a moment, watching the sun rise higher, casting golden light over the valley. It was a peaceful moment, one that captured the essence of their journey. From fear and uncertainty had come trust and companionship. From a single act of kindness, offering shelter during a storm, had grown a bond neither of them had expected but both had come to value deeply. As the day continued, they returned to the ranch to check on the remaining tasks. The fences were secure, the water supply was steady, and the cattle were calm. John felt a quiet pride. Not just in the ranch, but in the fact that he had kept his promise, that he had shown someone that trust could exist even in difficult circumstances. Lita felt the same pride, knowing that she had contributed, that her knowledge had been respected, and that her trust had been honored. That evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of red and orange, John and Lita sat outside the cabin. The desert was calm, the only sounds coming from distant birds and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Lita looked at John, her eyes reflecting the last light of the day. "You kept your promise," she said softly. "Through the storm, through everything, you kept it. And that means more than I can say." John nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "I did, and I always will. A promise is only as strong as the action behind it. You trusted me when it mattered most, and I promised you safety. That promise stands always." Her lips curved into a small smile. "Then, I trust you too, not just because of words, but because of everything you've done. That's rare." John felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was what mattered, not just surviving storms or repairing fences, but the human connection that grew from shared respect, understanding, and courage. Lita had shown him the value of knowledge, patience, and trust. He had shown her the power of keeping promises and acting with integrity. Together, they had built something stronger than either could have achieved alone. Night fell, and the stars filled the sky like scattered diamonds. The desert was quiet, peaceful, and full of possibility. John and Lita looked out over the land, reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. The storm, the fear, the trust, and the shared efforts had all led to this moment. They had proven that even in a harsh, unforgiving land, kindness and integrity could create bonds that changed lives. In the days that followed, the ranch continued to thrive. John's cattle were healthy, the land was maintained, and supplies had arrived safely. Lita's family, informed of her safety and the care she had received, felt relief and gratitude. She knew that she had found a place where she was valued, respected, and safe. And John knew that he had made a difference in someone's life, something far more lasting than any material success or personal achievement. The promise had been kept, and its impact extended beyond a single night of shelter. It had grown into friendship, trust, and a partnership that honored the strength and resilience of both individuals. The storm had tested them, the desert had challenged them, but together they had faced it all and come through stronger. As the sun rose once more over the desert, casting light on the ranch and the valley beyond, John and Lita stood together, looking toward the horizon. There was a quiet understanding between them, unspoken but profound. The journey they had shared had created something rare and lasting, proof that integrity, courage, and trust could survive even the harshest conditions. And in that moment, they both knew, no matter what storms came in the future, no matter what challenges the desert or life would throw at them, they had kept their promises, honored their trust, and found in each other a bond that could not be broken.